Check out part 1 of this timeline on my channel. Oh yeah, and I made a mistake in part 1. Here's what it was, and here's the correction on the screen. Anyway, back to the timeline. In our timeline, Bavaria had a communist revolution, so in this timeline I think it will have a technocratic revolution. After this revolution, Bavaria would willingly join the Technet. This would be the straw that breaks the camel's back for Germany, and it would become fascist soon afterwards. German fascism would be different from our timeline. The far right during the Great Depression was actually influenced by communism. One of the big things Benito Mussolini campaigned on was workers' rights, like his 8-hour workday campaign. But obviously some aspects of fascism are a reaction and an attempt to be different from communism. I think a way that fascism would be influenced by technocracy in this timeline is that the German fascists of this timeline, who would be different from the Nazis, would advocate for pan-Germanism to unite with more states, like Austria. I also think they'd get the German-speaking parts of Switzerland during the appeasement of this timeline. Maybe they'd go further to want pan-Germanicism, similar to how the Technet used pan-Slavism, but ways in which I think the Germans would react to technocracy, and their ideology would be very different from it, are that since German culture puts a lot of emphasis on hard work, worldwide Germans are known for their work ethic. And since in Russia the technocrats dismantled the traditional working hours economic system with a 16-hour work week to employ more people, and the fact that German society is more individualistic than Russian society, many Germans would absolutely hate this idea, wondering, why should I sacrifice my working hours for someone else? This ideology would probably cause Germany to reform its educational and economic system. As a backlash to technocracy, they would start to value hard work over qualifications, or if they already do, they would value hard work over qualifications even more. As for how they'd alter Germany's education system, apprenticeships are already popular in German education. Any form of education beyond high school would probably be replaced with an apprenticeship, with the only other way of attaining a non-entry-level job being working one's way up. Back to this timeline's appeasement. I think they'd definitely conquer Denmark just like they did in our timeline, and another Scandinavian country, or perhaps both of the other Scandinavian countries. I really can't say in specifics. Italy's economy would still fare very badly during the Great Depression, and would move further towards the political left as a response like it did in our timeline. And there might be a right-wing backlash like there was in our timeline, but certainly wouldn't become fascist, since it would have been more liberal from the unification than in our timeline. Not to mention the Italians wouldn't have wanted as much out of World War I as they did in our timeline, and since they would have joined the Entente before the war even started, they would have probably been given everything they wanted from it. An interesting scenario would be if it ended up with more influence from the Technet and also moved further to the political right. In such a scenario, someone like Oswald Mosley might seize power, who was a British fascist and was heavily influenced by William Henry Smith, who coined the very term technocracy. Turkey would likely become fascist and definitely join this timeline's version of the Axis in reaction to Greece, Russia, and France taking so much of its territory. Hungary and Japan would join the Axis just like they did in our timeline. It's very hard to say which side Romania or Bulgaria would be on. There are various ways World War II could start in the European front, and the beginning of the war would be different depending on which path is taken. Since there are a lot of variables involved, I'll just show them on the screen. However, the end would still be the same. Since Germany is facing possibly a 2 or even 3 front war immediately, with Britain and France on one side and the Technet on the other side, which has land in Germany already, Britain's navy would isolate Sweden or Norway from Germany and blockade its ports, while France would either be defending its borders or pushing into Germany. Italy may not have been the best partner for the Axis, but with France and Britain control the Western Mediterranean, allowing them to be supplied for wars in the Alps. So America will join the war in the Western Front to try to make sure Russia doesn't get too powerful, just like in our timeline. And unless Romania comes under the Technet's influence, it will be invaded in World War II regardless of whether it's one of the Allies or an Axis power, especially since even after it switched sides and joined the Allies in World War II in our timeline, the USSR still invaded it. The Technet simply wouldn't allow itself to be exposed on the Carpathian Mountains. Meanwhile, in East Asia, Japan would be devastating nationalist Chinese forces as it was in our timeline, and the Chinese Communist Party would be replaced by a technocratic faction. The only change during World War II is that instead of the parts of China and Korea liberated by the USSR being given to the Chinese communists in this timeline, the Technet annexes them. So the communists would lose the Chinese Civil War. Since the areas the USSR returned to China served as the Chinese communists' main base of operations for the Civil War, not much would happen in the way of proxy wars in this timeline, since technocracy is a rather isolationist ideology emphasizing self-sufficiency over world domination, unlike communism. However, the West would probably forge strong ties with countries like China, Iran, Afghanistan, Levantine and North African countries to prevent the spread of technocracy. However, China would become a superpower much earlier in this timeline due to motivating people to work harder or more creatively to get more work done 40 years earlier than it did in our timeline. I'd say that in our timeline, China became a superpower 2.5 decades ago. I'd say in this timeline it would be 2.5 more decades ago. But without Manchuria, the Great Leap Forward, or America lowering its tariffs, giving China all of those industrial jobs, China would probably be less powerful than it is now. But without the communist one-child policy, it will remain a superpower for much longer. So we can expect some proxy wars between China and the West, even though there wouldn't be much of a Cold War with the Technet. Smartphone technology would still be just as advanced, since the Technet and the West would still want to spy on each other. Since if you want to be left alone, you have to have a big enough gun so that no one will try anything. Making the Cold War so different from what it was in our timeline has a lot of butterflies. I'll just put the ones that I can tell as of this moment on the screen. I'm going to talk about what Italy would be like in this timeline, and then what would have happened to the Technet or the rest of this timeline. In our timeline, Italy got the absolute worst colonies in Africa. Since it was so powerless, the real colonial powers just let Italy get whatever they didn't want, and so invested far more into them than they ever got out of them. And since Italy would be more liberal in this timeline, I'd say it would be like Sweden, since Sweden is more liberal and more wealthy than Italy is and didn't have a colonial empire. Not to mention in this timeline, after the Italian unification, Italy would have taken more care of its own south and would have been harsher on the mafia. And Italy, unified by Mazzini, would have greatly focused on equalizing north and south. It was the Piedmontese and generally northern bias of the unifiers from our timeline that further damaged the south. Moving on to the Technet. By the 1950s, the Depression would be long over. The Technet would likely start to implement industrial democracy. So those 4-hour workdays and 4-day work weeks would be gone eventually. All workers would have a say within their respective departments and be able to request more or less working hours and on which days. No business would have an owner or CEO. Each worker will become a partial CEO and partial owner, like a shareholder. Wages would still vary due to supply, demand, length of time worked, and amount of productivity during one's working hours. The capital of each Technet that was planned for our timeline was what would have been known as a megalopolis, a vast stretch of metropolitan urban land wherein workers and intellectuals would congregate, produce power for the rest of the Technet, and operate all the necessary life functions of the national machine. The Eurasian Technet megalopolis would most likely be the parts of the Ruhr area in Germany that are part of the Technet, since that would be the largest industrial area in the Technet.